I'm realizing just how nerdy it is that I like sports when they're inside of D&D, and that's probably saying something about just like me as a human. Hey everyone, I'm Trevor, and I post D&D videos every week on Wednesday. In this video, I want to talk about the game Mage Tower. Now, you probably haven't heard about that game before because it's fictional. Mage Tower is the game played at Strixhaven, the newest Magic set. I've done a couple of videos now. I'm kind of incidentally building the Planeswalker's Guide to Strixhaven, like D&D edition, obviously, unofficially. But I wanted to create this because my players at my table really tend to like games within games. So this video is essentially going to be 3 parts. The first part is going to be explaining Mage Tower as quickly as possibly, based on the Planeswalker's Guide to Strixhaven, the article that will be linked in the description. The second part of the video will be kind of giving a brief overview for how I think Mage Tower could be run in 5e, and the written version of that, that's a little bit more detailed, is also going to be in the description. The last part of this video will be essentially an example. I ran a version of this game for my players on Friday night, and it wasn't exactly Mage Tower, but I'll explain that when I get there. Part 1, what is Mage Tower? So Mage Tower is the fantasy game on Strixhaven, essentially the equivalent to American football or Harry Potter Quidditch, that kind of thing. It boils down to capture the flag in a lot of ways. There's 2 teams, one from either college that happens to be competing in that game. They are not riding brooms, but instead there are 2 towers, one for each team in the center of this kind of coliseum. And at the top of each tower is a mascot from the 2 colleges that are competing. The goal is simple. You need to ascend the other team's tower, grab their mascot, and bring it back to your tower. And that is how you score a point. Now, there are some rules that are outlined in the article, and that's pretty much all that I could find about Mage Tower, except for like kind of random off remarks in card names and in flavor text, right? Like Umbral Juke is a card from Strixhaven that's referring to like juking out of the way, and that's pretty much all I had to work with. I don't even know how big the field is in Mage. I have no idea. And that kind of informed how I decided to make this game operate in 5e. One of the important things about this game is that magic is basically encouraged, like it's kind of necessary or it will be used. It's expected. That's the word that I couldn't think of for some reason. So magic is expected in this game, but any magic that would harm the tower, the other players, or spectators is not permitted. That really sums it up for what Mage Tower is on Strixhaven, unless between when I record this video and when it comes out, they release like an official rulebook or something. So part 2. Part 2 is how to play Mage Tower in 5th edition. And I was going back and forth on this one. I didn't know the best way to do this because obviously there's an argument to be made for running it kind of the way we run combat. I thought against that though. I worried that that would be a bit too clunky and too mechanical and very slow. So what I decided was a modified version of the skill challenge system, I think that's what it's called, from 4th edition. The way that it works is as follows. At the beginning of the game, a coin will be flipped, and the team that wins the coin toss will decide if they go first or second. I like that kind of choice. Then the way play works is the team that goes first, they can talk to each other. As a matter of fact, table talk is highly encouraged. And what they will do is individually, they will say to the DM what they are doing. And when I say what they are doing, I mean they will say a skill and how they're going to use that skill to kind of work towards some goal for the game of Mage Tower. There are examples in the document, and it also doesn't necessarily need to just be a skill. It could be an item or like a spell. The big rule of thumb is that it should be something that lasts roughly an action's worth of time. I did keep that kind of action, bonus action movement idea in mind when I was planning how much players could do during their round. It's hard because everyone has to suspend their disbelief and understand that this stuff is happening simultaneously, but that's impossible to do because if everyone's talking at the same time, it's just chaos. So, as an example, a player could say, I'm going to use my athletic skill to run as far as I can across the field. That to me means that they're going to move even like significantly farther than someone who's just moving across the field. I would say they're going to move even farther than like the dash action. It's kind of the equivalent. And someone could obviously say that they're going to do that as well. But using the athletic skill also implies maybe like dodging out of somebody's way or something like that. There's more to it. This does put a decent amount on the DM for how they're going to rule each individual thing. And I think they kind of fall into three camps. Some will just happen. Like, I'm going to run across the field. Kind of just happens, unless there's something working against you. Others will require a roll to see how well you do a thing. And that's D&D, baby. Like, that's just how it works. And some will require, I guess the roll kind of branches off into two categories, whether it's a roll against a set number or a roll contested against someone else. That player has our mascot, and I don't want them to score a point. I'm going to run over and attempt to tackle the mascot out of their hands. All right, roll a strength roll. And they're going to roll a strength, like an acrobatics roll to attempt to juke you out of the way and not get tackled by you. That's the kind of thought process that I would have for that. Before I kind of finish explaining this a little bit, I want to mention spells that would deal damage or attacks that would deal damage. I essentially just kind of ruled those out, or at least I ruled out the damaging part of them. What I did allow was for those things to be used to try to force someone to drop the mascot. I also, in the version that I played, that I'll talk about in part 3, I made the mascot equivalents just invulnerable. They couldn't be killed or harmed or anything like that. You don't have to worry about that. I think that that could be cool, but it seemed like way too much bookkeeping for me, so I disregarded it. So all three players on the first team decide what they're going to do. They tell the DM. They might need to write a die roll down just to kind of have that information stored so they know how well they did whatever they're doing. They might not. It really depends on what they decided. Then the other team goes, and it goes back and forth. In the actual game, play continues until the final round is over. I think the actual game is 3 rounds. My version of Mage Tower, I think, works better if it's just the first player or the first team to get the other mascot and bring it back to their tower. I think that that's enough time, but I did play with a lower level party. If you're playing with a high level party, I think you might be able to set like a time limit because they might be burning higher level spell slots. They might be doing things where they're able to grab a mascot and bring it back in 2 rounds, in which case you don't want the game to end too quickly. So there is, like I've been saying, a lot of DM flexibility involved in a game like this. I love that. I'm completely okay with it. So I hope you are as well. So part 3. How did this work out in my game? My current game is a Greco-Roman inspired game, and I swapped out the mascots in Mage Tower for amphoras of wine, but everything else stayed pretty much the same. I used 3 players because that's how many PCs I have. And I use 3 players on the opponent's team. I think it could work up to 5. After that, it gets a little bit unwieldy. The players on my PC's team were a Grey Dragonborn, played by my wife, a Poison Dart Frog Artificer, and a human fighter, kind of Hercules-style character. And then the opponent's team was a Leonin kind of monk, a human fighter who is like an adolescent, and a gnome kind of wizard or sorcerer, just magic caster of some kind. So my players decided to have the opponent's team go first. The Leonin darted across the field, tried to get to the amphora, made it about 3/4 of the way across the field. The human fighter stood kind of as a goalie in front of their tower, and the gnome kind of ran around and was attempting to obscure themselves, trying to be a little bit more stealthy and trying to use magic to either disrupt or get to the amphora, but not in a like directly physical sort of way. I think that this actually helped my players a lot because they got to see some of what their options were, and they also got to react to what the opponents did. So like my wife, who was playing the Dragonborn cleric, stood and mirrored the human fighter and like planted herself in front of the tower and guarded the tower. And our human fighter ran across the field and was attempting to get the other amphora. And our artificer tried to, I think they had the returning infusion, and they threw it at the gnome, attempting to knock them over and stop them. Again, I allow combat in the context not of dealing damage, but of stopping progress. I think that that's okay. I don't know if that's an actual rule in Mage Tower. Don't know what the actual rules of Mage Tower are, other than the 5 bullet points that are in the article. And that was pretty much it. It went back and forth. There were a lot of really, really cool moments. There was a really creative use of expeditious retreat. There was this fun instance of grappling, which is never a sentence you hear in D&D because grappling is normally just like a pain and a bunch of rules lawyering. There were some really interesting uses of like charm and hold person that weren't just combat or kind of ending a role-playing encounter. And it was just a lot of fun. There's a lot of spells that we didn't even get the chance to kind of use because it didn't come up, right? Like I only had these 3 players playing, so there's a litany of spells that we didn't get to. But my players, we talked about it afterward, they really enjoyed it. They ended up just barely winning. So what happened was the poison dart frog, like expeditious retreated, jumped to the top of the tower, got the amphora, and was on the way back. Actually, they used smite and knocked the, like brandishing smite, knocked the amphora back across. I compared it to Breath of the Wild, so like freezing the item and then hitting it and launching it into the distance. So essentially to do that. And they did that, but the Leonin almost had it. And then my wife was playing the Dragonborn cleric, charmed the Leonin, and then the Leonin gave it to our fighter who ran back up our tower and scored the winning point. So like it was this back and forth. It was a lot of fun. Like I said, we talked about it afterward and they really seemed to enjoy it. My players have always liked games within games, and I wasn't sure exactly how this one would work. I had never made something quite to this degree, but they liked it a lot, and it gave them a creative way to run their characters without it being strictly combat. And it was more involved than when you just have 1 or 2 characters participating in role-playing or exploration, because they all got to play their part, which was a blast. So there's a lot here. And I will note that this is a lot of pressure, or it can be a lot of pressure on the DM because of how creative or open-ended this can be. I don't have a problem with that. But if you want something a bit more linear, then that's fine. I completely get that. If you end up using this resource, let me know. Even if you just have ideas for different fun spells or skills that could be used in this game, I would love to hear it. I love thinking about D&D in this capacity because this kind of narrative fun stuff, this is the way that I love to do it, right? This to me is engaging. I'm realizing just how nerdy it is that I like sports when they're inside of D&D. And that's probably saying something about just like me as a human, but I'm good with it. So if you end up using this or have any feedback for me, as always, drop it in the comments below. And please be safe. Make smart life choices.